Okay, it's 9:15 now, so I will go ahead and get started. You are here today to see the introduction to Groovy here at Open Source North today. If you want to follow us along or look at these slides later, they are posted on GitHub, both a hosted version and the source of the slides as well. And I'll tweet out the link after the talk. So a little bit about me to get started. I am a consultant at Object Partners. We're a local consulting firm. I definitely have a lot of Groovy, Grails, and other related technology developers and consultants. I'm also the co-founder of an organization called Great Ladies. So Great Ladies, we're here. We have a booth. We're a meetup group and community organization to support women, whether you're using Groovy, Grails related technologies, or whether you're interested in learning. We have a variety of different events that will fit your needs. My professional experience has been all over the board. So I've done a lot of front-end work. I've done a fair amount of services, APIs, things of that nature. I've done everything from JavaScript to databases, lots of different experiences, and some of these you'll see in my comparisons to other languages. Okay, I am based here in Minneapolis. Most of the speakers here are local. If you want to connect with me, the best way to do so is Twitter, but you can also connect on LinkedIn and view any of my presentations on GitHub. Okay, so enough about me. Let's hear a little bit about you. We can just do show of hands type thing so I get an understanding and make sure that we're covering everybody. Are there any students, people who are still just new to coding? Okay, a couple. And so everyone else here is mostly professional developers. Anything from Java to .NET. Anyone even using Groovy already? 1, 2. Okay, but yeah, there's always a couple. And it's good to get feedback. Hopefully they won't tell me I'm wrong. So, okay. So this is a general overview of the Groovy programming language. We're going to start out with the background, talk a little bit about the ecosystem that surrounds Groovy, and get into how to even get started with using Groovy. Concepts. Through some of the examples, we'll learn about the different data types, some of the collections, functions and closures, basic things you want to know about when you're first learning a language. And we'll move into some more complex topics like object-oriented programming, how to use Groovy for scripting, including some file processing and an API example. So the question everyone's probably wondering, what's Groovy? So Groovy is a dynamic compiled language for the Java virtual machine. It is interoperable with existing Java libraries and makes Java a lot, the platform and everything that's behind Java a lot easier to code. You get faster development time with a lot of other nice perks. And it is used, it's a language that's been around for a long time. It's 12 years old now, so it's definitely mature. That was where I was looking for. And it's used by lots of different companies, small companies, big companies, even some in town, Best Buy, Target, Wells Fargo, and Mutual of Omaha are some of the local ones that we often work with. Okay, we are at an open source conference, so we want to talk about Groovy being open source. So Groovy it's 12 years old now, it's very mature, but it's had kind of a wavy path. So it started out being sponsored by different companies. They had full-time developers that were working on Groovy and the framework Grails. And starting, let's see, they announced it in the end of January, but it went effect the end of March, that Pivotal, the VMware spinoff, company dropped Groovy and Grails from its support. So at a kind of position. What do they do now? So Groovy wanted to ensure that it maintained over the course of time. So it joined the Apache project. Everything is at groovylang.org, and it's in an incubator phase at Apache now. Even though it's been around for a while, they're going through the steps, learning how to deal with the Apache process, and should be a great thing for the longevity of Groovy. Okay. And like I said, Groovy is not just a language. There's a whole ecosystem of technologies. You may have heard or worked with some of these before. So Grails is the most popular web application framework. It's a full stack. You've got your MVC style web application. It's switching a little bit with the times to be more focused in different areas. Anyway, there's Griffin for desktop applications, Gradle. So Gradle is a build tool that lots of other platforms may have used before, even if you're not using Groovy. You may have used Gradle as a build system for Java. There are testing capabilities from Spock and Jeb. So testing is one of the first places that organizations start when they start using Groovy. Getting into your testing framework, you usually don't have to deal too much with getting it into your platform because it's not really production code, right? Once you start learning Spock and Jeb, you realize how awesome Groovy is and convert it over. There are lots of other smaller projects within the Groovy ecosystem, like Ratpack, which is now moving more towards Java, but it does have a way to use Groovy in Ratpack as well. Okay, so my one little architecture diagram to kind of show you a little bit of what this looks like. Just basic blocks. So you've got Java, the Java virtual machine, and Groovy. One important thing to know is that Groovy is not compiled into Java and then down. Groovy has its own compiler. You can use it separately and not have to do that conversion. But it does play nicely. There's a nice, some diagrams if you want. Groovy in Action is the go-to book for Groovy. That describes it more as an interlock, so you can use Java and Groovy together very nicely. Okay, so a little bit, when do you want to use Groovy? Biggest thing is if you're already using Java. So if you have existing Java libraries, if you have developers that are already familiar with Java and the JVM and how it works, and especially it runs on the JVM, so you should have infrastructure to support deployments to the support JVMs. But you can also use it for some other things. So I've used it in like startup weekend type events for some quick prototyping, especially with the framework Grails. You can scaffold out a lot of code a lot faster. You can use it for scripting. So if you're on a server and you just want to run some quick scripts, you can write Groovy scripts to do that. And the biggest one is definitely writing tests. Not going to say that it's the perfect tool for everything. So if you already have a bunch of legacy code in another language, or if you need that super fast performance, Groovy, don't try and fit a square peg into a round hole. It's not going to work for you. Okay. So I'll kind of move here a little bit and show you some examples of how to get started. So you can download Groovy locally, or you can, a lot of us use, it's called the SDK Manager now. It used to be called GVM, the Groovy Environment Manager. And it's really easy to install via a curl script, and it allows you to interchange between different versions of lots of different SDKs within each different terminal. So if you have different projects running on different versions of frameworks or languages, you can easily switch between those. It's a really cool thing you should check out. Okay, so once you get Groovy downloaded and started, there is a Groovy shell. So if you just want to kind of do some quick things, but I definitely prefer the Groovy console. So it's got a full UI for running kind of just test scripts. You can even save them from here and rerun them later. This is what I'm going to be using for some of my examples. I don't see anyone with their laptop out, but if you did want to go through the examples, there is a web console too. just to kind of try it and test it out. Okay, so before we get started in the examples, here's a few things and concepts we're going to see throughout all of the Groovy examples. There's probably more than one way to do it. Groovy is based on being very flexible. So whether you're coming from Java or other languages, you're going to see some things that may look familiar, some things that may not. Do the one that feels most comfortable to you until you get the hang of it, and you can use some of the more efficient ways. Also, it's probably optional. So Groovy makes things like semicolons. You don't have to type your variables. You can use optional typing. You don't even have to put parentheses around your parameters. If you have a simple print line, we'll show how that works. Another important thing is that the return statements are optional. It's going to, by default, return the last command that was executed. So whether you're in a function, whether you're just in a script, that last thing is what's going to be returned. Okay, hello world example. Every programmer starting a new language starts with. So here we have a few things to notice. I'll go into the console and do this. Is that big enough for everyone to read? Hopefully. Okay, so we're going to do open source north. Okay, so I went and ran that. One of the things we notice here is that it's just a basic print line. We don't need a main. You don't have to have any of the other stuff. It's going to build that out for us. And even if we go in and we can inspect, it does some cool things with the compiler, we'll show that it's creating some of these main methods behind the scenes. Okay. So another thing to notice is that, I don't know if you can see this at the bottom, it says the result was null. So print line is void, so it's returning that last thing here. We don't have parentheses, but if I add them, it's totally okay with that too. Okay, so the next thing we want to talk about is data types. So there's lots of different basic, you can still use your Java primitives, but what it's going to do is treat them as objects. So if you have an int, it's going to treat it like the auto-boxed integer. The typing is also optional. So if you don't necessarily want to define it or don't know what it's going to be yet, you can use def and it'll be optional. But that doesn't mean that it's dynamically typed. It still gets defined as a generic Java object. It's just optional, not dynamic. Okay, so what does this mean? So if we look at this example, we have int, so your little I int, and big integer, and these are both using the same class. Another thing, if you're not familiar, so we're using dot notation, and you get a bunch of properties that you can access based on the way that this is laid out. So you can access a class and its name. Pretty cool for not having to write any of this stuff on the, anyway. Okay, so the next thing we're talking about is this optional typing. So you get def. So def, or you might be familiar with var if you've used something similar, another language. It's what you use when there's either you don't want to specify a type, or you can use it for flexible typing too. So I can, you can see where this might be useful in like polymorphism to pass in multiple different types of things and then run some command on it. So in this example, we're looking at, in the first case, it's an integer. So if you take the integer times 2, then you're getting the result. But you can also just use it as a string next go round, and it's going to treat it as a string times 2. So you wouldn't get the cast error that it's trying to multiply by a number. You get these overloaded operators for all of for strings, collections, lots of different cool built-in things. Okay, so next on to how strings work. It's really basic, but kind of essential for the rest of the examples. So there, in this case, we were looking at a single quota string. which may be different because you may be used to using single quotes as characters. Single is just means don't evaluate it, use it exactly as it is. But if we want to do a variable, I can do def name I can replace this with $name, switch these to double quotes, which is called a G string, Groovy string. And that will insert in here. Similarly, we can do multi-line strings using 3. Just some interesting things as we go through the next examples to know. Okay. Clear that out and go back. Okay. So once we move on from our basic data types, we may want to collect those into various data structures. The simplest one I want to go over is lists. So lists are collections of items without an index. It's just, you can use it like a stack. You can use it very flexibly. Okay, so should be readable, right? Okay. We can declare a list just with square braces, and we can put various things in there. So you notice that this is a heterogeneous list. You can have strings, you can have different data types, you could have objects within here, you could have lots of different things within your lists. There's access in the same way. So in this case, the first one, let me highlight here. So we're doing access at array index. So it's like an array in this case. You can assign it the same way. There's lots of different, so instead of, you could use either the shovel or push to add a new item into your list. It will by default add them to the end of a list. You can also use push and pop like it's a stack. So kind of some interesting and neat things that it adds in. If you want to learn more about the different collections, look through the source on groovylang.org. There's Groovy docs for all of these different methods and types. Okay. We can also operate on lists as a whole. So we can do multiplication. So when you think, how do you multiply a list? Multiplying a list is taking it and having 2 of them just together, just like adding them together. Okay. So the next type of collection that you might want to go through is a map. So a map is kind of like a list, but you get your keys and values. You can define it in the same way. You don't need to do new array list or new anything. You can just use the square braces. Okay. You can access it via dot notation. So this is the key val1, and it's going to print out the value, which is A. You can also have strings inside of your notation. So if you have a character like a dot in your key name, if you tried to do dot in like this, it would try to be A dot B. But if your key name contains a value that you need to like escape, then you would do it this way. Or if that's what you're more comfortable and familiar with. To access the keys, it's key set, which was kind of counterintuitive for me. Normally it's keys, but this was key set. And dot values works as you would expect. Okay, so the next one to kind of look at is ranges. So ranges are incremental from, you could do from 1 to 10, or 1 to and up to, but not including 10. Interesting when you're doing just some basic math examples like I'm going to show. Okay. Next important thing we need to cover is how functions work. So functions are very flexible. This is where a lot of the optional stuff comes in. You don't have to use your parentheses. In this case, I didn't even type x, my variable here. And there's no return statement in here either. Okay. So if I'm gonna copy this. And it did take all of it. So I could do integer or I could do def times 2 of x is x plus x. And we get this. Okay. So very simple here. You don't have to use these either. I could, in this case, use a string instead. Makes it very, very flexible. Okay. So one of the things that we get into next is closures. So closures are a concept kind of like they're not exactly anonymous functions. They're not exactly code as data. They're not like lambdas in Java 8. They're very unique in how Groovy handles them. So let's take a look at what I mean. So a closure is your type, and you can, it looks like a function, except that we don't have any parameters here. We're defining everything within our curly braces. So in this case, this closure is going to take a name and a year. We're using default parameters here, so if you don't specify, it's going to just work. Here I've got my Groovy string, and I'm inserting the values into my string. You can either call them directly, so they don't get run automatically. You have to, like functions, call them. And they get passed, you can pass them into various other things. So you can either call it or pass it in as a variable to another function. Okay, so this comes into effect when we look at the way that looping works. So loops start with the basic for loop that we think of when we first start learning programming. You get your integers and you increment up. So in this case, I'm taking the numbers 1, 2, 3 and doubling them. It's going to be a persistent thing, how I look through the different examples. So we get, as we double them, 2, 4, and 6. You may also be familiar with the in notation. So you can also say within a list. So for each I in this list, do 1, 2, 3. Okay. But there's lots of different ways to do it in Groovy. So you can take, so SL is my single list, my original digits 1, 2, and 3. Then need to declare the list where I'm going to store all my answers, so doubled list. I'm going to take each item in that original list and do an each on it. So each in this case is taking a closure. So this from here to here, I can't select very well in here, sorry. So from between the, it's a function that's getting passed as a parameter to each. And seems really easy to read that it looks like you're traversing through this list. And for each item, so IT is the default. I didn't need to specify this. If I leave out, you can just use IT as your iterator. And so IT times 2 will add it to your list. And you get the same result. So there are lots of different ways to double the numbers from 1 to 3. It can go even simpler though, because you don't need to specify your result and then add each element to it. You can use a collect to take, by default it returns, so it takes this return value, so it's going to take it times 2, and then each time add that to your result, which is defined as a list here. So that's what it returns from the collect. Whereas in each doesn't, it doesn't return your mutated list. Okay. So can get even simpler. We can use an operator specific to Groovy called spread dot, or at least we call it spread dot. So if you take a range from 1 to 3, so this is talking about the numbers that are incrementing 1, 2, and 3, and multiply them by 2, we should get 2, 4, and 6, right? Nope. We get 1, 2, 3 again, because we're operating on a list, so, or a range of numbers as a whole. But if we wanted to operate on each element individually, that's where we'd use this spread dot. So the spread dot, so star and then a dot, tells it to take each item individually, and then we get the 2, 4, 6. Okay, so here's kind of a little brain exercise, a little bit of a break for a minute. Try to think of how you might print the sum of numbers from 1 to 10. Okay. Okay, and I do show, yeah, I'm gonna go over 2 examples and then the one-liner for anyone who can figure that out. Okay, so we're going to go over the answers now. Give you, if you've had a minute to think about it. How many iterated through the list individually? It's totally okay to do this, and that's how we often start. You can do your I and then less than, or I in this case. Take the answer and then go through. You could use each to do it that way. But if you saw the one-line answer, it was to use a range because it's just the numbers from 1 to 10. So we've got a iteration, and you can sum those. Okay. So the next kind of interesting thing to talk about is the Groovy truth. So Groovy handles truth a little differently, similar to some languages, but different than many others. By default, null, empty set, empty string, empty map, all count as false. The one that throws me sometimes, but it can also help me, is 0. So the number 0 is false. Oh. Equality is also kind of in here too. So you've got double equals and triple equals. So double equals compares based on the value, whereas triple is actually the object identity itself. So things need to be the same type exactly and everything. Okay. So this means that if you've got a list or a list of numbers, this time I'm adding for 0, 1, 2, 3. If I do, so for each number in here, if it exists, print it. But we didn't get 0. So if you're dealing with lists that contain the number 0, you should definitely be careful there. Okay. Some other interesting kind of operators that are in here that saves me a lot of time is this Elvis operator. So we may have seen like a ternary operator where, so if a value X exists, return X, and then otherwise return something else. Something you do over and over and over again, but you can use the Elvis operator. So it says if X exists, return the value of X. Otherwise, return whatever your else condition is. You can also null safe it or add a null safe. So if you're doing deeply nested objects, you won't get null pointer exceptions if you're adding in null safes. Okay, so this comes into play when we do searching. So within a map or a list or any of your collection types, you can do a single find to find the first value that matches, and then it stops. So in this case, 2, 4, and 6, I'm going to take the values that are divisible by 2, but not divisible by 3. So this should match 2 and 4, but not 6. So when we do a find, it pulls the first one. However, we can also do a find all to get all of them. But if you're thinking about efficiency, if you only need to test if it exists, that's a separate function, but maybe you only want the first one in the list. Do that rather than having to traverse through all of them. Okay. You can also do any or every to do some of these truthy things. So if any value is divisible by 2, then that's going to be true. But not everyone is divisible by 3. Okay. So moving along, we'll talk about how we incorporate this into object-oriented programming. So Groovy can be used for scripting, and it can be used traditionally as object-oriented as well. This is a fully complete class. That may look very small if you're familiar with some other languages. You get 2 properties. You don't have to declare public, private, protected. If you want to use another type, you can, but by default, you use public, and it's much simpler. Okay, so let's take this example back to the console. So class person, string first, string last. Okay, so I can define a new, so person me is new person. So first, okay, so this notation may not look familiar to you. You may be used to having to do new person and then person dot for each, and setting each property. There's a nice shortcut here that you can use these names and define them right here in the constructor. So it's building up all of these helpers to use before we, so we don't have to do all of that boilerplate stuff. So if I get, I get a person, and then I'm going to print first name. Okay, so this, I didn't have to set a getter, or I didn't have to define a getter. I get this here. If I want to set, my full name is actually Jennifer, I can, and then print it, it'll update. So you get getters and setters without having to write them. But if you want to do your own, you can. So I work for, we talked about, I work for a company called Object Partners. So I'm going to add in another string company, and then I'm going to define my full name. Nope. Okay, so I'm doing get full name, but there's no full name defined as property. And okay, oh, the other thing I was going to show in here, so I'm adding company in, but I don't define company. I can add company later, or it'll just be null. Okay, so back in here. So this is, sorry, trying to scroll back and forth with it blown up so you can see. So I still have my person. And if I do print of me dot, actually I can just return it, me dot full name, then it returns the result here. So I didn't have to define a property. If I use this default, or convention, sorry, of get in a property, it'll add that in. Some things that kind of cool, make life easier if you're using Groovy. Okay, so I can take this script and I'm going to save it as people. Okay. And close out of the console. To run that script, it's simple. You can have it on the command line and just run scripts. Okay. Of course, with scripts, another thing you may not get in other languages is that the entire script is parsed first. So I can have a function definition way down here, but I can use it first before it's even declared. In some languages, that may seem very strange because you'll get an exception or it won't exist if you're using it before it's declared. But the way that Groovy parses through the entire script, you can do stuff like that. Okay. So this comes in handy. We were doing saved it as a file, but I can process files as well. So it handles a lot of the default things that you normally do with files. So if you open them, you have to close them. If you don't remember, you can end up with all kinds of crazy memory problems in files that end up in awful situations. So you can use defaults and just do new file. If it's not there, it'll create it. And you can write to it and then append it. So we've got here friends, no parens, showing all the different variations. Defing a new file. So we've got foo. And if we look at foo.txt, it would contain this hello and then open source north. Okay, so the next thing we want to do, now that we've created a file, is we want to read it in. So there's lots of functions to read in individually, read in as a stream. But if you're just doing simple processing like of this tiny short file, you can use each line. So each line takes a closure, and I'm going to call each line a line, and I'm going to replace hello with hi. So in the previous example, we had hello and then open source north, and just for simplicity, I'm going to replace any instance of that text with hi and print it out. And so it goes through each line, so each first is hi, and then open source north didn't modify anything and had no problem with that. Okay. So the next example, getting a little more complicated, trying to put some together, is an API example. So I'm going to grab this. I'll open my Groovy console again. Okay. Oh, it did keep the big font. Great. Oh, except that's way too big to read. Okay. Can you still see that, even in the back? Thumbs up? Okay. So the first thing in here is a grab annotation. So when you're using or when you're starting from a script, you can grab in external dependencies with an @grab or grapes. In this case, I'm going to pull down an HTTP builder. Uses the same notation that you might be familiar with, group module version. Then I still need to import it to specify, but I have it available here. You create a new REST client. So this is what this is called. And so I have a public API at greatladies.org/API, and then I'm still working through some of it to aggregate gender ratios from different companies that are using Groovy and Grails all over the world. And so I aggregated the data, and we can sort through this. So I'm going to do a get method on /API/companies. I'm going to get back a response and a reader. So the reader, we can go through and look at our results. So I'm going to sort them by the descent. So negative is how you specify descending order in a sort. Sort by the percentage of women in descent. So these are going to give you, and then only the first 5. So I'm going to get the top 5 companies of women that are using Groovy and related technologies that have submitted to my project so far. So we take this closure, I'd probably put a space in there. So here's where that 0 comes into play. So if I take if it employs and the number is 0. So if they aren't reporting, it's going to return 0 because that's the way I manipulated it, so we didn't get nulls. But if the value is 0, I don't want to include them in my printout. So I just do an if, and it'll exclude them. Otherwise, I want some basic data information here. So I'm going to go ahead and hit run. It's going to take a little bit. Hopefully on this Wi-Fi, we can grab the dependency. So here it says it's resolving. Okay. This does take a little bit. So this is definitely one of the reasons, I mean, if you're doing a short thing like this, otherwise you'd want to build a project and have these dependencies already. It's downloading, it's artifact. Okay. So we get our output. So we get the name, the company, and these different variables that I had specified. So we have a few different ones, and I did take anonymous, so if the person didn't want to say who their employer was or didn't feel comfortable displaying those numbers, and we get several different things here. There are lots of public APIs that you can use if you want to just kind of test how this works, maybe submit an example because something's broken. Another popular one is the Chuck Norris jokes database. And it uses same thing, but a little simpler than my custom example. And you can even specify different things like path and how many in this case. And use the dot notation to go into your results, get a particular thing, and then say for each one. Okay. So there are lots of other cool things in Groovy. So we can do regex pretty simply using standard notation. The other thing that is this meta class option, so you can overwrite things at runtime, at compile time. There's whole books on all of the fancy things that you can do with Groovy in meta classing. Groovy is also an option for Android now. So as of the 2.4 release of Groovy, there's support for Groovy using compile static annotation. So if you're used to type checking and you start using defs, you may run into a few issues and you don't notice them until runtime. That is one of the disadvantages of using Groovy, is that some things that the compiler would check, if you're being too flexible, it won't catch until runtime, and that can be a bit of a problem. But you can use compile static annotation to make sure that you're using your type checks and not doing too crazy things that would blow up at runtime. And those were great features that were added between the two, and we're now at 2.5, 2.4, something. Anyway, lots of changes that have been happening recently to support long-term productivity. Okay, so in conclusion, Groovy is great because it provides a lot of the same benefits of the JVM platform. So if you're familiar with it, you've got infrastructure supporting it. Groovy's a great language to use. It also adds a lot of features that enhances your productivity. So you don't have to write all that boilerplate code. You saw how simple it can get with printline. But yet it's still very similar to other languages. If you're familiar with Ruby and Python, some of the dynamic nature is, you can see that here too. Okay, so if you're looking for what to do next, you should definitely read Groovy in Action. It's a huge 800-page book. I've got it sitting at the Great Ladies Meetup table. If you want to take a look, it is the definitive and go-to guide for learning Groovy. They just came out with a new version in June, so the second edition. The groovylang.org also has full documentation. And there's another one similar, more like a cookbook or a reference guide called Practical Groovy that's free. The link is in the slides. So all of these are red are links, and it'll take you different places. And that's a great guide to show you examples and more reference material. Okay. So that brings me to the conclusion. What questions do you have about Groovy? Not everyone at once.
What would you say? I know you mentioned one disadvantage, but are there other disadvantages you should be aware of?
I mean, the biggest one is running into runtime errors if you're a little bit too loose in your typing. Another thing, you can run into some performance problems if you're using certain methods that aren't meant to be used in the way that they are. So definitely be careful with using the guides to make sure that you're not looping over things you don't need to. We were talking about the finding and searching. So if you really only need the first item, or if you need to check whether it exists in a list, don't traverse the whole thing, things like that.
You run into issues with larger teams dealing with free typing, where one person likes all the correct and spaces and someone hates everything, and
yeah,
kind of the mismatch communication between team members.
So it's definitely important to have a style guide so that you don't argue over those things, or if you do, you argue at the beginning when it's set. And you can use a tool called CodeNarc. So CodeNarc is a kind of like a style enforcer, lint type thing for Groovy. And you can set up your own custom rules. So if you want to enforce that, you can across large teams. Okay.
This is my question. Did you mention earlier that it's a source from the slides?
Yes. So it's on GitHub. I'll tweet the link out after. Normally I have it timed, and I forgot today. I'm sorry. Let me get back to the beginning here. So my GitHub handle is JLStrader. So for these, it's jlstrader.github.io, and then the name of the repository is for any of the GitHub pages. And that's, if you notice, that's what I'm running off of right now. Okay. And then there's a link to the repository too, which is mostly just the slides. And the Groovy example is in here too. I think we still have, 10 more minutes for questions. Went a little quicker this time. Are there any other features or things that you would want to know about Groovy? Things you're using in your organization? Okay. We can end early. That's cool. Yeah.